Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer, and I'll be your professor for today. And, well, I could say it, but let's all pray it instead, all right? Because here we are. I mean, we're almost there. So let's talk about it today. Last time we talked about the Reagan administration. We spoke about the highs and lows, the promise to balance the budget and end the deficit, and I guess that's the same thing, but in the debt, start paying down the debt that actually went quite the opposite direction. We talked about the international changes and how Reagan had promised a more direct and confrontational stance with the Soviet Union. First called them the evil empire in 1983, but that's a promise he kind of backed off on that I think we're all better off for, because eventually the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union did not end in a nuclear war. So you see a shift. You see the man evolve in office, and you see him end out pretty popular. And today we're going to talk about what happens after that. One sec. There's something I haven't told you guys about in this class yet that I want to show you because it's pretty fascinating. Another thing that Reagan did to maybe change history here. The curse of Tippecanoe. This was a curse that when Ronald Reagan was running for president in 1980, this curse had been going for over a century. And this curse was that since 1840, every president who won an election in a year ending in a zero had died in office. 1840 is William Henry Harrison. 1860 is Abraham Lincoln. 1880 is James Garfield. 1900 is William McKinley. 1920 is old Mount Jerry himself, Warren G. Harding. 1940 was Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1960 was John F. Kennedy. And 1980, Ronald Reagan runs for office. And you guys are like, but didn't he make it out? Well, turns out about 2 months after he was inaugurated, a guy tried to kill him as he was walking out of a speech in March of 1981. This guy let some bullets fly. He hit Reagan, actually hit another guy who was with him, last name Brady. And Reagan was 70 years old. Reagan was the oldest president elected ever in history at that point. Before that, the oldest president had been William Henry Harrison from 1840. So the nation's like, and Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, she was all into like astrology. You know, these people that read the stars. And like one of her astrologers had warned her, like, oh, he's walking into this curse. This could be bad. Dude gets shot. Nancy Reagan's like, oh no, the stars were right. Well, guess what, guys? Whatever you think about Reagan, this dude broke the curse. He broke it. He lived. Ronald Reagan lived. He broke the curse. But he didn't stop the attempts. Because who's the next president elected in a year that ends in zero after Reagan? George W. Bush. I know it's confusing because there's two of them, but this is the son of the guy who was Reagan's vice president. And I don't know if you guys saw this assassination attempt, but I'm just going to play it for you. It's, I'll just let you guys see it. So hopefully you guys won't be, this won't be too rough for you. Here we go.
Zero. It doesn't bother me. And if you want the facts, it's a size 10 shoe that he threw.
Oh man! So yeah, it's year 2000. This guy comes at Bush with a pair of shoes. I love it. This guy, and let me ask you this: this guy was like, "I'm gonna show George Bush what's up." This is in Iraq, right? You guys know there's a whole war there and everything. This guy's like, "I'll show this guy," but it just turns out he makes Bush look awesome. This brings me to an important lesson. That guy threw one shoot, he missed. Second shoe, he missed. If you look, you see that after the second shoe, Bush looks fairly confident. But if that guy had had a third shoe, he probably would have gotten away with it. Who expects a third shoe? Nobody expects a third shoe. And that's why the lesson is always bring a third shoe. There you go. This guy, Bush, that we saw dodging shoes. His dad was the vice president under Reagan, and in 1988, when Reagan steps down, this guy is going to run for president. He's going to run against a guy named Michael Dukakis. Dukakis is looking pretty good early on in this election, but things fall apart for him. I'll just say this. The most, kind of looking back on it, one of the silliest things is Dukakis wanted to act like he was strong, like for the military. So he recorded this ridiculous commercial where he's like riding around in a tank. Like this video where he's riding around in a tank, but he looks like such a goober in it that it makes people look at him and just kind of laugh at him. And looking back on it, some people have said that actually affected like people voting for him. So I don't know, if you're going to ride in a tank, look cool. I guess that's the lesson. I don't know. That's not like the third shoe thing. Okay. Third shoe thing's serious. I don't know. Tank thing, subject to debate. So this guy runs. Now, he had been the director of the CIA in the 1970s. Actually, Bush had been the guy who was brought in after the Church Commission. Remember, all the information comes out about all of the abuses of the CIA abroad? Bush is the guy who's brought in to help clean that up. So he's got a reputation there. He had actually challenged Reagan in the 1980 Republican primary, and he did pretty well. And looked like he was going to be one of Reagan's big rivals. But then Reagan pulled a page out of the long, proven playbook of bring them in, right? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of thing. Instead of looking at him as a rival, Reagan's like invites him in, right? And you can see this being a strategy. This goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who had done this with his cabinet. Later on, Barack Obama does it with Hillary Clinton. So it's been a strategy that has played out over time. So you got this guy, he runs in 88, and here's the thing. The economy, I told you guys, by the end of the 80s, the deficit is growing, the debt is growing. You have that crash in 87, but you're starting to see that there's not much of a recovery coming around too. And people are beginning to say, hey, look, this experiment with these massively low taxes, this is not working for us. And some people are starting to call for an increase in taxes to try to help deal with this situation. During this campaign, Bush makes this promise.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
While this guy's in office, let me give you his track record. I kind of wrapped this up the last lecture by talking about this, but look at these things that this guy oversees when he's in office. Within the first year he's in office, the Berlin Wall falls. You guys remember we talked about the Berlin air blockade and all this tension, Berlin being the site of Cold War tension. In 89, the Berlin Wall falls. The Berlin Wall had been a symbol of the Cold War. It collapses while Bush is in office. Now, to be fair, it's not just Bush doing this, Reagan who's doing this. There are a lot of factors at work. But nevertheless, you're the president when this happens. Wow. And then on December 25th, 1991, while he's in office, the Soviet Union collapses. Eventually breaks down into 15 different countries. Former parts of the Soviet Union had started leaving already in the 80s, but now you got 15 different countries that are broken down. Russia, of course, being the core of it. It was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus. Did I name them all? This guy is the president in the era in which the Cold War really, the nails in the coffin of it. While all this is happening, at the same time, Saddam Hussein. You guys may recall Saddam Hussein. This guy in Iraq. I showed you a picture of a guy named Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with him. We had supported this guy in a war against Iran, secretly funneled weapons to Iran. It's a long story that I covered a little bit before. But this guy Saddam Hussein decides he's going to take Kuwait. Kuwait is a small country that shares a border with Iraq because it used to be a part of Iraq before the British kind of cut it off when they left and withdrew in the 1930s. Iraq, actually for not completely insane reasons, Saddam Hussein says, well, this is illegal. You can't just cut off a portion of a country. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying I'm on Saddam Hussein's side with this at all. There's pretty much nothing I'm on his side with. But this, it's not like he just decided he was going to annex another country. There had been a history of of that being a part of Iraq. Dude makes a boneheaded decision and just rolls into Kuwait with his military, and the United States is like, nope. Had a long-standing relationship with the family in Kuwait, the royal family there. They are an oil-rich country. You guys can imagine that we're still in the era of fear about oil prices because of what had happened before. So the U.S. sends a military in there. Starts out as Operation Desert Shield to stop Iraq advancing. Turns it into Operation Desert Storm. This does not last very long once it turns to a war. Now keep in mind, aside from Grenada, that tiny island that I told you that we rolled into for 4 days in the early 1980s, the United States military had not been abroad. The United States military had not been part of a big major operation really since Vietnam. And the world hadn't seen the United States military at work since it was basically getting defeated, run off in Vietnam. Turns out, guys, we had some pretty amazing new technology, and this war is over pretty quickly. Remember how I told you that Americans had felt that defeat from Vietnam, and boom, a quick victory, superior military? Guys, Bush is the president when all this happens. People tend to give the credit or the blame to the president. So you guys must be thinking right now, as you would almost certainly think if this is all you knew about it, you'd be like, man, people must have loved this guy. But you guys remember when he said, read my lips, no new taxes? Made that promise. That is a clear promise. It's also a bit of a problem if you're the president, because who decides the tax rates? Is it the president? No, it's Congress. And Congress is controlled by the Democrats, and they pass a tax raise. And Bush now has to be in the position, he has to sign it into law. And he does. And he gets destroyed as if he did it. That's what's crazy. Don't make promises you can't keep, first of all. Second of all, he didn't really do this. But this happens, but it's also because this happens in a very, very, very bizarre moment for the United States. The United States enters a jobless recovery. This is not something that had been part of economic models. Usually when you see a recovery in profits, when you see a recovery in the stock market at this point, usually these things had meant that when you see these indicators that we still for some reason use as indicators of the economy, oh, the Dow Jones is up. Oh, really? That's amazing. So how's that affecting the working person that doesn't own any stock? It's not a particularly good model. GDP and things like that. But all these things begin to look like they're improving, but the United States is still in a recession. And this recession begins in 1990, and it goes throughout Bush's presidency. And you can see right here on this map, look at this, right? This is the unemployment rate. During this period right here, in 1980, you already had it going up, but then remember it had gone down. And you're seeing it go down towards the end of the Reagan administration. And it's really low compared to where it was when Bush runs for re-election. But look what happens beginning in 1990. It starts going way back up. It goes back up until 1992. And it begins to go down then, but by this point, you've got, you're rolling into this election. So at home, Bush is struggling with the state of the economy. I want to go back to this question of the Cold War now. There's this idea that the Cold War, it was a war, and so somebody had to win it if it was over. And I'll tell you that Americans certainly took that as as the truth. Americans have taken credit for winning the Cold War, and it has led to some really unfortunate conclusions. It's my assessment. It's an assessment that is shared by Ambassador Jack Matlock, who I showed in the last lecture. He said he thinks that Americans' perception that they won the Cold War kind of set the United States up for a lot of unfortunate things that happened in the 1990s and beyond, one of them being the state of U.S.-Russian relations. The Soviets had voted to dissolve the Soviet Union. The economy was faltering under the last years of the Soviet Union, but they were looking to reform it. The United States could have been an ally in that. But essentially what happens is once Bush comes into office, and this is an assessment of the guy who was the ambassador under Reagan and then continued for a bit under George H.W. Bush. Once it looked like the Soviets were beginning to fall apart and lose their status as a superpower, and Bush came into office, he put the Cold War on the back burner. He put Russia on the back burner. He basically ignored the relationships that Reagan had built. And successive administrations, and let me tell you, this has by and large been a bipartisan issue. Successive administrations have treated Russia in particular as a defeated country. They have not taken seriously Russia's concerns on the international stage. And we're talking about a country with one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, a still massively strong economy. We made promises we did not keep. NATO expanded into the countries surrounding Russia, a country that, historically, has been invaded a lot. Do you guys recall, just in this class, 2 times a world war had first Russia and then the Soviet Union facing enemies at the gates. Now NATO continues to expand. If you guys recall, NATO was established during the Cold War as a military alliance focused on fighting the Soviet Union and communism. You might think then that after the end of the Cold War, NATO would go away. But it did not. And it continued to expand. And it came closer and closer to Russia. Because we did not take them seriously. Because we won the Cold War, so they lost. That's our mindset. It has not led to a very good situation in the world, particularly with U.S.-Russian relations. Now, I am no friend of Vladimir Putin, but there's only the things that you can control. Sometimes the United States has had a problem remembering the history behind things. It's one of our great problems, I think, in the world, is that we have a memory sometimes like a goldfish. We're like, why does Russia not trust us? I don't know. Did we turn our backs on them when we said we were their friends? In the war in Iraq, they stepped up to help us with oil reserves. Sorry, this is actually after 9/11. After 9/11, they stepped up to make sure that we had a reliable oil supply. Russia is one of the largest producers of oil in the world even today. Gave us clearance to airspace that would otherwise be off, basically be theirs. The United States promised that we would not be continuing to expand NATO, and promised that, this was a better relationship. And then we just went ahead and expanded NATO. I still see this today in a lot of ways. Anytime you hear, pretty much, not anytime, but almost every time I hear anybody talking about Iran in the international community, in the United States media, they're like, Iran's horrible. Iran, can you believe that Iran doesn't trust us? Why is Iran such... Well, I mean, you could also consider that there are people still alive today when the U.S. CIA led to the overthrow of their democratically elected government and put in place a tyrant propped him up for a couple decades. All these things compound. When you don't learn the lessons of history, a lot of times you make uninformed decisions. It is not crazy that the Iranians would not trust the United States. As I said, we probably wouldn't trust the country that had overthrown our government 60 years ago either. But we treat them as if they're the ones with the problem a lot of the times. Now again, let me say, I am no friend of the Ayatollah or theocracy whatsoever. I'm a big fan of democracy. But there's only what you can control. These countries know their own history. The fact that we are ignorant to it sometimes catches us, puts us in bad situations. In reality, there were a variety of reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev had implemented reforms that completely changed the system. The economy was in terrible shape. And yes, Reagan's approach to the USSR did help create an out there. But to say that the credit all goes to the United States for bringing down this victory, as I said, not such a good lesson to take away. Now on a lighter side, back to the domestic environment. For all the sadness of the economy and the hardships, one good thing that George H.W. Bush did give to us was perhaps one of the most ridiculous politicians that we've ever known. A guy named Dan Quayle. Now, Dan Quayle was in the Senate, but Bush brought him in as his vice president. And Dan Quayle, people forgot about him. People forgot about Dan Quayle. Forgot about Dan Quayle because of Sarah Palin, probably. You're like, oh, who could be goofier than Sarah Palin, right? And can I say this? Come on. There's plenty of them on all sides. Even Biden's had a few gaffes in his day. But Dan Quayle, let me just share some Dan Quayle with you, all right? This guy's great.
Let me just tell you how thrilling it really is and what a challenge it is, because in 1988, the question is whether we're going to go forward to tomorrow or we're going to go past to the back. And I can tell you, listen, we don't want to go back to tomorrow. We want to move forward. I believe that I've made good judgments in the past, and I think I've made good judgments in the future. And the future will be better tomorrow. Well, Bobby Knight told me this. He says, there is nothing that a good defense cannot beat a better offense. In other words, a good offense wins. I was known as the chief grave robber of my state. I have a very strong record on the environment in the United States Senate. Hawaii has always been a very pivotal role in the Pacific. It is in the Pacific, the part of the United States that is an island that is right here.
For those of you whose eyes may be fluttering in disbelief, let me repeat that. Hawaii has always been a very pivotal role in the Pacific. It is in the Pacific. It is a part of the United States that is an island that is right here.
He's a very different man from the intellectual midget that has been portrayed in much of the media.
That last quote, did you guys recognize that guy? That's Richard Nixon, who was still kicking it at the time. Nixon comes out and is like defending Dan Quayle. And let me just go back to some fantastic quotes here from Dan Quayle while he's vice president. Here we go. I'm just going to read these. The Holocaust was an obscene period in our nation's history. No, not our nation's, but in World War II. I mean, we all lived in this century. I didn't live in this century, but in this century's history. Here's another one. Mars is essentially in the same orbit. Mars is somewhat the same distance from the sun, which is very important. We have seen pictures where there are canals, we believe, and water. If there is water, that means there is oxygen. If oxygen, that means we can breathe. We understand the importance of having the bondage between the parent and the child. And finally, we're going to have the best educated American people in the world. But the real kicker for Dan Quayle, and this is the one that really solidified him for me, was that Dan Quayle went to an elementary school for a spelling bee And one of the kids drew the word potato. The kid walks over to the board and writes down P-O-T-A-T-O. And Dan Quayle, well, standing there with him, goes,
You write phonetically. Put up. There you go.
the Vice President of the United States tells a kid to add an E to the end of potato, and it's on film. This is where we're going to end. The end of the 1992 election. Because this brought about the president that really is in the era that historians have yet to grapple with. I mean, we're really getting to the point where the 80s gives us the hindsight we need. This is just happening. The 70s and 80s are becoming a new era that we research. Historians need time. Right? I mean, this is the idea, is that historians should have time, that new information should come out. We shouldn't just be reading the journalists' accounts of things. We should wait for the documents, the evidence, and a little bit of the passion to cool. Modern politics brings with it the passions of the day. And, you know, it takes a couple decades. So this is where we're going to end, the 1992 election. Here's how it goes down. You've got George H.W. Bush, the guy that we were just talking about, killing it on the international scene, getting killed on the domestic scene. He's up against a young, slick guy from the state of Arkansas. Governor there. Guy by the name of William Jefferson Clinton, a.k.a. Bill Clinton. But there's a kicker here. Because not only is he up against him, he's up against this third-party candidate. Now, it's been a long time since the third-party candidate ran with the type of recognition here. George Wallace had done it. But Perot gets recognized as an independent party member, and he's part of these debates. And while you have kind of the standard, you know, you see Bill Clinton, and again, you know, back to the whole thing of Nixon being the last liberal president. Americans love to throw these things around. They're like, so-and-so is the most liberal person, blah, 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 the most conservative person. And in America these days, liberal or conservative just means asshole depending on which side of it you're on, right? The other one's just always the worst, right? Oh, that's liberal. But it's really not. Bill Clinton actually, and every president since then, has been shaped by the shifts that happened in the 70s and the 80s. You're not talking about people going back to relying on the state and using the state in the same ways they had since the New Deal to about Nixon. One of the issues that comes up here, and one of the reasons why Ross Perot decides to run, his big issue was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. He believed that if this was passed, American jobs would go overseas. Here's a famous quote where he says that if you pass NAFTA, you will hear a giant sucking sound of American jobs being sucked down to Mexico. NAFTA wasn't a free trade agreement, and it lasted until recently, and it's basically been put back together in mostly the same way as far as I understand. I haven't dug into the new terms of this deal that was worked out under the Trump administration, but NAFTA was a deal, free trade agreement, that was the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So Perot is running, and he gets the voice of a lot of people. And they hear him, and they begin to support him. And I will tell you, I remember this. All right, so this is another reason why it's better to stick back to earlier things, because once your own story's really, really, really memorable in these things, you know, it takes a different turn. I remember the 80s, but they're far more vague. By 92, I was paying attention to things like politics. I was 14. I guess not that much. So Perot did a crazy thing. This guy is a billionaire. This guy is loaded. And so he takes out ads. He takes out ads on, not ads, but he buys airtime on major networks and does like 1 hour lectures where he uses charts and like explains what he thinks is going to happen. It's crazy. Nobody's really done this before. And he runs. And here's what's fascinating. He's looking good in the summer of 1992. And then suddenly in July, he announces, nah, I'm not running anymore. And people are like, what? How much money did you spend on those commercials? And everybody's like, what happened? Well, then suddenly in October, he comes back in. And who knows what would have happened? Who knows what would have happened if Perot had stuck with it? I don't know if it's possible that he would have won. There's conjecture. But I will tell you this. Deciding you really want to be the president at the beginning of the year, and then in the middle of the year being like, nah, I totally don't want to be the president. I'm done. And then in October saying, hey, I want to be the president again. I don't know if that's the kind of behavior I want out of somebody who's running for president. It's like, what you going to feel like in 6 months, dude? You're just going to be like, I'm going to quit. But in this election, you can see the numbers here. In this election, Bush loses. Clinton wins. But look at the popular vote here. The percentage of people who vote for Perot still is massive. And in some states, this is the story, is that a lot of people probably who voted for Perot probably would have been more likely to vote for Bush. So poor George W. Bush really couldn't ask for a better 4 years on the international scene, but man, his luck on the domestic scene, not so good. But you can't take away the credit here, because it's only fair to acknowledge that Bill Clinton is a pretty charismatic guy. Now, you've got Ronald Reagan, who is this great communicator, this great speaker. The country really, really, really loves this guy. So you got him. But then you got Bush. Bush is a little bit colder than Reagan. Bush looks a lot more like Carter than he looks like Reagan. Bush had been kind of a bureaucrat. He'd been an agency guy. Not like the public face. And so, again, he doesn't do the best job of making Americans feel good about the situation they're in either. On the other hand, Bill Clinton, pretty slick. And people looking back on this election so far, they've identified a moment where you really see Bill Clinton shine during these debates. It's actually like a town hall thing. And this, let me just show you this. You can see how these folks look.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Well, I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally.
On a personal basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
Well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think
How?
think that they're going to be able to afford an education. I think that that's an important part of being a parent. Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
What I'm saying
I'm not sure I get it. Help me with the question and I'll try to answer it.
I've had friends that have been laid off from jobs.
Yeah.
I know people who cannot afford to pay the mortgage on their homes, their car payment. I have personal problems with the national debt, but how has it affected you? And if you have no experience in it, how can you help us if you don't know what we're feeling?
I think she means more the recession, the economic problems today the country faces, rather than the deficit.
You ought to be in the White House for a day and hear what I hear and see what I see and read the mail I read and touch the people that I touch from time to time. I was in the Lomax AME Church. It's a black church just outside of Washington, D.C. And I read in the bulletin about teenage pregnancies, about the difficulty that families are having to make ends meet. I talk to parents. I mean, you got to care. Everybody cares if people aren't doing well. But I don't think it's fair to say you haven't had cancer, therefore you don't know what it's like. I don't think it's fair to say, whatever it is, that if you haven't been hit by it personally, but everybody's affected by the debt because of the tremendous interest that goes into paying on that debt. Everything's more expensive. Everything comes out of your pocket and my pocket. So it's that. But I think in terms of the recession, of course you feel it when you're president of the United States. And that's why I'm trying to do something about it by stimulating the export, investing more, better education systems. Thank you.
Governor
I'm glad to
Clinton?
clarify.
Tell me how it's affected you again.
Um,
You know people who lost their
Well,
jobs
yeah.
and lost their homes?
uh-huh.
Well, I've been governor of a small state for 12 years. I'll tell you how it's affected me. Every year, Congress and the president sign laws that make us do more things and gives us less money to do it with. I see people in my state, middle-class people, their taxes have gone up in Washington and their services have gone down, while the wealthy have gotten tax cuts. I have seen what's happened in this last 4 years when, in my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. When a factory closes, I know the people who ran it. When the businesses go bankrupt, I know them. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this ever since October, with people like you all over America, people that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance. What I want you to understand is the national debt is not the only cause of that. It is because America has not invested in its people. It is because we have not grown. It is because we've had 12 years of trickle-down economics. We've gone from first to 12th in the world in wages. We've had 4 years where we produced no private sector jobs. Most people are working harder for less money than they were making 10 years ago. It is because we are in the grip of a failed economic theory. And this decision you're about to make better be about what kind of economic theory you want. Not just people saying, I'm going to go fix it, but what are we going to do? What I think we have to do is invest in American jobs, American education, control American health care costs, and bring the American people together again.
Thank you, Governor Clinton.
You guys catch that? That shot when they cut back to George H.W. Bush, and he's just like he looks almost just in a stupor over what Bill Clinton's doing. And Bush has no answer. It just makes it look as if he is completely isolated from the world. Whereas Bill Clinton is able to walk over and say, let me tell you how it affected me personally. The classic old slick Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. I can feel you. That's the Bill Clinton. And he wins. NAFTA passes. But it's not just the president. Again, you got a Republican Congress at that time, Republican House. Now, to be fair, Ross Perot was right about American jobs going to Mexico for about 15 minutes. Because shortly thereafter, Bill Clinton signs, a couple years after, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton signs a treaty with China giving them most favorable trade status. Which means that most of the jobs that probably would have gone to Mexico otherwise now go to China. And you guys know that story. The class covers up until the 1992 election. But history ends right now. Right this moment. The moment you're watching this. You're where the story ends. We're all part of it. It's hard to see when you're young, but you'll see it later on. We can't escape the past, but knowing it allows us the ability to act gracefully in our relationship with other people, in our relationship with other countries. It allows us to actually see what they've gone through, to appreciate their struggle, because we all suffer. But showing ignorance towards that, especially when it's very convenient for yourself, it doesn't look like a friend. It's cost us over the long term. So many times in this class where an unawareness of history at the time that people are acting has cost us. Bay of Pigs invasion, for example. Everyone knew that it was going to go wrong, but Kennedy did not consult any historians to understand what was going on in Cuba. Our relationships with Iran have suffered because we have not acknowledged our history there. Our growing problems with Russia, I would contend, are a sign of our own unwillingness to acknowledge that we've been part of the problem in the past. Now, none of this means that we still have to be. This is not fixed. It's not permanent. None of this is permanent. We can't leave the story because we're in it. But we can decide new ways to go. And I think that acknowledging the past when we deal with other people the way racism has shaped this country, the way it continues to shape this country, dealing with other countries, with the Cold War and our interventions abroad have shaped the world, continue to shape the world. We are not bound by the decisions of people who came before us, but we cannot escape them. I hope that you guys realize that we're all products of our time and place. We're all born into a world in which the people around us, the last generation, the generation before us, teaches us about what's right and what's wrong. That's changed over time. Unfortunately, while there are universal values, a lot of the lessons that we're taught are lessons that worked at one point. So people think that they always work. They don't. You got to be nimble. You've got to be willing to understand that your time and place is a function of the conditions surrounding you, and that sometimes the same policy does not work because of different conditions. Don't be bound by ideology. Keep a big toolkit and ask yourself, what's it going to take to fix this? Because we have seen moments in this class where taxes have been high and things have been fine. We've seen policies, times in this class when taxes have gone up and they've been a problem. We've seen times where the government has stepped in and done things and done that successfully. We've seen other times where the government has absolutely bumbled things. I don't ever want to give you guys a conclusion about where to go with things, because that to me seems insane. I kind of need you guys to fix a lot of these problems for us because, we did, my generation and the ones before did leave a lot of problems for you guys, and I apologize for that. But I want you guys to understand that you've got to keep your mind open to things. History proves that there's no one surefire ideological solution to life's problems. I want you guys to be kind to each other. Remember that the best things happen when people work together. Draw lines around each other and let other people draw lines for us. We find ourselves divided. There's one thing, just another thing that history teaches us, is that if you want to keep people in check, keep people where they are, one good way to do it is to pit working people against other working people. Focus on the differences, when in reality, we have way more in common than we have different. And I want you guys to really look at this class and appreciate that sometimes it feels like you can't make things better. It does. It's especially a problem for you guys because you're young. And young people want change right now. But change takes time, takes work, takes persistence. If you work on it, it can happen. Because I know this. I'll just leave you with this. My father was born in 1945 when segregation was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. My son was born in 2014 and we had a black president. That's 3 generations. So stay focused, love one another, and if you want to make the place better, let's leave a better inheritance for the people who come next. I'm Dr. Sawyer. That was the last lecture. I'll see you guys in class or in review sessions or anything like that. And when we get back on campus, y'all come meet me. I'm a real person. I know you guys might not think that I exist, but I'm actually the one who thinks that you don't exist. So I hope to see you in person. Come to review sessions. Sawyer out.